I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which UBC is located is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And of course, please feel free to share your own land acknowledgements depending on where you are in the chat, if you so wish. Thanks so much for joining us for this session. I'm going to just introduce myself, and Tara will introduce herself briefly, and then we'll get right into it. My name is Feroz Anwala. I'm an assistant professor of teaching in the Department of History and chair of the Middle East Studies program. Tara, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I'm Tara Mayer. I'm an associate professor in the teaching stream. I'm in the Social Justice Institute in GRSJ at UBC.
Thanks. I'm just going to share my screen now. All right, so this session, we've titled it Embracing Emotion and Emotive Writing in the UBC Classroom, Benefits, Risks, and the Ways Forward. Again, thanks so much for joining us for this discussion. This is a subject that Tara's been working on for quite a few years now, and I've started working on it well, more formally in just in the last two. And you know, I'd identify us as two scholars who feel deeply about the work that we do in the classroom and out of it, and who care deeply about this subject. And we hope that out of this discussion that we're going to hold, that we can find and grow a community of scholars and staff and students at UBC that are who are interested in the subject and potentially even want to work together to collaborate on this subject in different ways. And you know, just to say that, I'll at least say this for myself, that while I've been working somewhat formally on this subject for a couple of years now, I don't feel like I'm an expert on this subject. I come at it from a very specific vantage point in my field, and I feel like there is a great deal to learn from others in different fields and in different disciplines, and who have different tasks at the university as well. And so truly, I'm hoping that in the discussion that we do have, you know, we get to learn from you and your experiences on this subject. So just to tell you how the session is going to go here, I'm going to talk first, and then Tara on how we came to work on this subject in our respective fields, and what we've been doing on this subject, in our separate departments as well. Well, after that, we'll break into small groups and have a discussion depending on the number of people that we do have here, and then have a large group discussion where we hope that you will share your ideas and thoughts with us, and then we'll wrap up and move forward, hopefully with some new projects and new ideas for projects as well. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about, again, where I'm coming from with it, and how I came to think about emotion in the classroom. To start, I would say that emotion has always played a large role in my work and my teaching, even when I did not necessarily recognize it in the classroom, by which I mean I did not overtly recognize it with my students. I did not explicitly talk about it with my students or the emotive stakes. I knew it was there. Part of this has to do with the fact that I teach on quite difficult subjects, subjects like genocide and ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism, conflict, state terrorism, and more. And a lot of this work has been specifically in the Middle East, in Middle East studies, but I also teach comparative courses on some of those subjects as well. And I know for a very long time, as long as I've been teaching and working on such things, that it takes a toll on me. I'm frequently emotionally exhausted by this work, even while I feel it's necessary, and I have to keep doing it. And as such, I know it can and does take a toll on a lot of students, and recognizing that it takes a toll on some groups, some demographics more than others, depending on the subject at hand. And you know, especially since I've been at UBC and been on the educational leadership track here, and reading more critical pedagogy and more recently a lot of anti-racist scholarship, it's for myself, I think the idea of broaching emotion in the classroom has been destigmatized. I was trained in a very particular way, and I think for a very long time I thought, I don't talk about my emotions, and I don't ask students to talk about theirs, and I don't talk about emotion at all with some of these subjects. But it's been destigmatized more and more for me, and I've been trying to figure out ways to bring it into my Middle East Studies classrooms in particular. Now, just very briefly to talk about Middle East Studies itself here, and how this has impacted the way I've approached classroom emotionality. Teaching in Middle East Studies can be difficult for some of the reasons that I talked about before. Really difficult subjects, of course, but there's also a much longer history here, and we could go centuries back to think about, thinking about the history of Orientalism and Orientalism as an academic field. But maybe just for now, talk specifically about Middle East Studies as a field and its emergence in the Cold War out of the U.S. security state. And again, really briefly, a lot of the literature, the scholarship that's produced around this time is by these supposedly, quote unquote, neutral outsiders producing supposedly objective knowledge about something called the Middle East, whereby the voices, perspectives, and yes, even the emotions of those in the region itself, those who are being discussed in the scholarship, are very much left out and or discussed in very specific and often negative ways, which leads to this idea of Middle East exceptionalism. And this is something I've come across a lot in my courses. The idea that the Middle East is an exceptional place, and that's often posited in a very negative way. It can mean many things. This presentation, I might just say that the Middle East as a region is frequently framed, and unintentionally by myself sometimes in my courses, framed as this kind of land of unending conflict and despair even. And again, this can take a toll on students. It can obviously replicate certain unfortunate and even dangerous ideas, and it really has an impact as well on those who could be considered Middle Eastern students too. And there's, beyond the emotionally heavy topics that frequently come out in my classroom, that I deal with in my classroom, there's also a lot of really emotionally sensitive and fraught subjects as well. And I know from my discussions with other instructors in my field that often there are a lot of instructors who simply avoid these kinds of discussions, avoid some of these topics sometimes too, while others will explicitly, and they say this openly to me at least, and to others, that they explicitly try to shut down emotive discussion on these subjects. Part of that, I think, is protecting ourselves as instructors, right, and not taking on those kinds of risks, but also and purportedly, at least, this is to protect students. And I've been having a lot of trouble with that idea in recent years. And I guess one thing that became really clear to me was that with a lot of my quote unquote Middle Eastern students, that there was a stark difference in the way they talked in the classroom and the way they talked to me when they frequently would come to my office hours or to this extracurricular series that I run called Continuing the Conversation, which is outside of class hours. In the classroom, they very much felt the need to talk in very specific ways and to not reveal certain perspectives and certain feelings that they had towards subjects, whereas they would be very open with me, or more relatively open with me, at least in office hours. And I would say, why don't you say this in the class? This would be something of value for the class to hear. And they'd say, well, I don't want everyone to think that I'm biased. And so, a lot of these students, and not just the Middle Eastern students, I would argue, are feeling like they could not speak honestly and openly in the classroom because that was not encouraged. This was not in line with certain academic conventions that they had come to know. And so there was this lack of honest, open discussion in the classroom that I felt, at least, was perpetuating certain inequities between groups, benefiting some groups and disadvantaging others, and it was undermining learning in the end. And we came to the pandemic, and this really hit home for me because, of course, we were talking a lot about mental and emotional well-being. And I was thinking about my own emotional well-being, my students' emotional well-being, and teaching my Middle East history class at the time. And it really hit home for me the impact that my class, with the subject matter it was covering, that I was covering, and the way I was covering it, could maybe be having a negative impact in a lot of ways on my students, and maybe even for myself. And so I started this continuing the conversation series outside of class hours to have more of these open, honest discussions with them, to give outlets, different kind of outlet for students. And I was teaching for the first time the subsequent semester, the core course of the MES program, which had just been created. And I just threw away the syllabus. It had been a rather rote course, I felt, before, really standard kind of introduction to the Middle East course. And I threw it out and I created something brand new, something that was attempting to acknowledge emotion and emotionality in the work that we do, something that was girded by a social justice framework, as well as by this emphasis on critical hope, in hopes of addressing this kind of Middle East exceptionalism. And so, just briefly, I wanted to talk to you about some of the things. And the course has evolved even over the last year and has changed. And I'm actually working with students in a Students as Partners project right now to change the course even further, and with a focus on these what I call emotionality interventions in the class. And so this just introduces a few of these interventions really briefly, but one of the things is, we talk about this dark, troubling history of Middle East studies and area studies at large, and what the kinds of knowledge it produced, the kinds of questions and conclusions that people reached in this kind of knowledge. And then we try to turn it on its head and create something new to posit a new way of looking at Middle East studies. And so we think about working against this quote unquote neutrality, and there's an explicit call in the syllabus itself to emotionality and critical hope. There's me in various ways being quite vulnerable with the students and talking about my own feelings in doing the work that I do, whether it's in the classroom or outside of it. And emotive short reads, these can be by academics, but also by activists and artists and others that present a different way of describing the Middle East. And dedicated time for openly emotive small group discussions. And then the big piece was a major emotive writing assignment that I co-created with the students, themselves. And this last semester, I was able to get some funds from the Sod Al Seed Fund to study these interventions, and we did a general survey, a reflective survey specifically on that emotive writing assignment, that major piece, and we had focus groups on it. As well. And I don't want to go through too much of this right now at this moment, but just to put a few things out there to you. One is that from the data that we're analyzing still right now, students were overwhelmingly in favor of bringing emotionality into the classroom and in assignments. They were inspired by the scholarship and other writings that we did read, and really took to the frequently emotive discussions that we had in class. And they were shocked, and I would say some were even angry that they'd not been exposed to it in other UBC courses. This is not to say that it's not there in other UBC courses, but depending on the discipline that students are in, and I've had a lot of students who are in political science and IR especially, they were kind of like, why hasn't this been introduced to us before? Why haven't we had these opportunities to engage in this kind and see this other different kind of scholarship there? Overall, students felt that this increased their awareness of inequities in the academic classroom and knowledge production. and help to create this new understanding of MES's potential as a field and academia in general. And one of the most interesting things that's coming out of the data, since we were asking students how they feel about this, doing this kind of work, whether it be the discussions, these emotive discussions in the classroom or these emotive writing assignments, is that the students could feel at least simultaneously liberated and empowered on the one hand, and then anxious and frightened on the other in doing these kinds of assignments. And in the Sawtell Seed Fund study, I was one of the things I wanted to explore was the impact on students' emotional well-being of these kinds of emotionality interventions. And so the data suggests this is really complicated, that when you bring emotion into the classroom, it's not going to just by itself have this positive, what we would call it, maybe call a positive impact. Students are going to feel very conflicted about doing this kind of work because it's going to bring a lot of different things to the surface, and especially depending on where they are from and their relationship to the material. And just some general contentions, and I'm hoping to get your thoughts on these in our discussion. The first point is a little bit is what I was saying before, that the impact on emotional well-being, ours and our students, is complicated. It's not so straightforward as saying that this is always going to be a positive thing. Although even that positive negative dichotomy, I think we need to complicate it and destigmatize certain negative emotion, so-called negative emotions. Seems clear to me from my work in MES, at least, that the ways in which we acknowledge emotion and bring emotive expression into our classroom, it really depends on what field we're in, what our discipline is. And I'm hoping to get your ideas on the different emotive stakes and touch points in your own fields and disciplines. Third, emotionality from this experience, emotionality by itself was not enough. It's clear that students need a lot of guidance, and they need other kinds of criteria and ways of thinking about emotion and emotive expression to help guide them, and to provide a kind of rigor to what we're doing in the classroom and assignments, and to move beyond a kind of which a few students did, not a lot, but a kind of ranting which focused solely on the self. And so we were playing with how to acknowledge our positionality and how that impacts what we write and what we say, at the same time of engaging emotion and emotive expression in service of something greater than ourselves, and of causes and other peoples and ideals beyond just ourselves. And the last one seems obvious, but using these emotionality interventions and bringing emotion into the classroom was fraught in several ways. And I don't think it was so simple as making the course more inclusive, and actually it made the course more inclusive to some students, particularly a lot of students who might identify as Middle Eastern, whereas for other non-Middle Eastern students, it felt less inclusive. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing necessarily, by itself, but it was jarring to a lot of students. And this could not be about just being able to talk about more and more traumatic subject matter either. It was not about a kind of trauma dump that we can push on the students. Rather, what I was trying to do, and I don't know fully of whether I succeeded, is about reflecting on emotionality itself and how open, honest, emotive work might change our fields and our sense of it. I'll stop there. I've got a lot more that I could say, but I want to pass it over to Tara, and so she can share with you her thoughts and her experiences.
Thanks so much, Feroz. Really, thank you. And it's so wonderful to be here with all of you. I'm absolutely delighted to see all of you. And Feroz, really thank you for really what was just such a nuanced and kind of subtle, sort of guiding through your own trajectory and pathway through this topic, and revealing some of the complexities actually in this topic and theme that I think all of us working in this field are struggling with and grappling with in very imperfect ways. Very much students ourselves in this field. I want to just say a little bit about my own relationship to this topic, where I'm coming from, and some of the things that I've been doing and contributing. I'm a historian of colonial South Asia, the relatively modern period, so about 1800 onward, which coincides with some of the most heinous episodes of colonial violence in the subcontinent, episodes of racial and gendered violence that have very, very strong legacies and presence in the contemporary era. In fact, like Feroz, we come from, actually, we were both trained at the same, I shouldn't say a similar, the same institution with a horrendously colonial name, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, which in itself is an institution that has a profoundly colonial history of its own. It was set up to train linguists and translators who would take up positions all over the British Empire and further imperial causes and agendas. It over time became quite a vibrant and progressive institution of post-colonial scholarship and learning, a birth of what's called subaltern studies in the field of history, and many other sort of progressive and at least at the time seemingly radical schools of thought and scholarship. And it was in this place, actually, learning about the history of South Asia, the history of India, a place to which I have very close and personal familial ties. My mother is from India, that I had a very complicated educational experience. On the one hand, a very powerful and in a sense kind of comprehensive and competent grounding in the history itself, chronologically and contextually, but that left me as a student in my undergraduate years as well as my graduate training profoundly sort of adrift and quite alienated in many ways from the nuance, the depth, the texture of the material that I was actually grappling with. And I think a lot of that really had to do with the fact that I was never taught by anyone from South Asia, except for someone who had a very impermanent position at SOAS for a term. That was quite a remarkable teaching experience for me in my own training. But for the most part, I was trained by people who themselves had no particular stake in the subject matter that they were teaching. And like Feroz described, they had been sort of assiduously trained in methodologies and practices that sort of expunged the history that they were teaching, engaging with, conveying, from any real emotional content or emotional weight. And I think that that absence spoke very loudly. It was very palpable and present, I think, particularly for South Asian students whose lives and family histories had been irrevocably changed, altered, affected by these legacies of colonial violence. This an image of partition, largest mass migration in human history. And so many of the students in these classes in London, of course, were generationally linked actually very closely to these kinds of episodes, these unfoldings in South Asia. So it was strange to be learning what was such a kind of dense and rich and potentially fruitful, topic, a true kind of inquiry into human experience, all the while with a sort of, a premium, a priority, and an emphasis being put on a sort of objective neutrality, an at-distanceness, which, of course, comes from long legacies of Enlightenment thinking, the likening of humanistic disciplines like history to sort of the sciences. We have this sort of strange, fondness for scientific methodologies, even in the humanities, likening ourselves to scientists, social scientists of human beings, imagining actually that we can, through particular methodologies, arrive at perfect outcomes, conclusions, narratives that are sort of watertight in some way through their objectivity. And so this experience, to say the least, left me feeling quite alienated from the topics that I was or had originally been so profoundly drawn to. I don't think that this is even a sort of a wound or a lack that I was particularly aware of at the time, at least not in its full depth. It was something that was so normal, really, to learn history this way, through chronologies and timelines, through a sort of emphasis on objectivity and neutrality, that I don't think I questioned it particularly until I stepped myself into the classroom, actually, at UBC. I had taught elsewhere, but it was particularly at UBC where I was in front of, predominantly South Asian students who were disproportionately Punjabi and who had themselves thus been largely affected, their families also, as part of this wider South Asian diaspora, and as the result of sort of the migration that happened following the partition of India and Pakistan, which had particularly violent and difficult sort of occurrences, for this region, for the Punjab. And so it was, in this classroom that I realized that the kinds of methodologies and pedagogical practices that I had been taught were simply not going to do justice to the inquiries, questions, familial legacies that my students were bringing to the classroom, and their questions as well. And so it was at this time, actually, really in the first few years at UBC, that I began to kind of experiment with forms of pedagogy and teaching that invited students to offer of their own experience very directly, to offer personal narrative, to offer instances of biography, to make inquiries into their own familial histories, the implications of these histories for their own story, and to share these with the class. And this was not always easy, as you can imagine. It wasn't easy for students, and it was also not easy for me as an educator, and especially a very novice educator who didn't have much experience in this realm at all, and was making up a lot of these things as I was going along, simply as an intuitive response, actually desire to allow students to imagine that expertise could be, in fact, could reside already in them. In other words, could not only maybe be something bestowed upon them by someone at the front of the class, but something that they held by virtue of their own embodied experiences and familial experiences. This was really, in a sense, as difficult as it was, kind of gratifying. I remember very particularly early on a student who was conducting an oral history of her own community, Punjabi community, and she was conducting oral histories and doing kind of a histories honors thesis. And at one point, she came into my classroom very, very emotional herself. She was in tears, and she was saying that, she just didn't think that she could continue doing that research. And immediately, almost kind of without hearing her, I just said, look, you can kind of stop it there. You don't have to hurt yourself. This doesn't have to feel so hard, and you can kind of, work with what you have. You don't have to kind of push it any further. And I had thought that actually just the sheer weight, the difficulty of this extraordinarily traumatic history was simply overwhelming for her, very understandably. But curiously, it wasn't that. As she began to speak, what she was really saying is, because she's so connected to the community that she was doing this research and conducting these histories in. These were her family members. These were people who they were part of her local Gurdwara. She was, in their community, that she didn't think that she could be a neutral or objective interviewer, that she didn't feel that she could do justice actually to the stories that she was gathering. She was worried about her own credibility and expertise. And it was in that moment that I realized actually what a profound disservice we do for students by continuing, in a sense, to perpetuate this notion that proximity and intimacy and emotion are somehow corrosive and eroding to the capacities and potential of a budding scholar. And so it was eye-opening for me, and served to, I think, affirm my commitment, however imperfect, to continuing to experiment with with teaching styles that brought in, that included, that actually even centered, emotional experience, personal history, biography, and narrative. I experimented with teaching histories of contemporary South Asia and modern South Asia, colonial South Asia, by totally decentering sort of master narratives, grand narratives of sort of what happened, and instead supplanting them with only instances of personal and oral history, of which there are so many in the field of South Asian history, many archives on the history of partition and other major episodes of South Asian history. And interestingly, as Feroz said, watching students in incredibly diverse classrooms, as we have at UBC, react to emotional content differently, is something, I should say, that's always a challenge. There were students who had been, absolutely, keen students, sort of the first to arrive, last to leave, full of questions, excellent sort of keen, engaged students who, very quickly within, a process of hearing about the lived experiences of survivors of partition, recounting their own memories, would push themselves away from their desk, bring out something to read. A couple of them took out their phone. They were overwhelmed. They were checking out. They didn't want any more. And that observable sort of stance of just of not, it's not even not wanting, but not necessarily being able to, absorb or engage fruitfully with a certain depth and quality of emotive content is something I think we observe commonly, and it's unevenly distributed in our classrooms, which vary so enormously, not even sort of class to class, but just even the same class semester to semester, year to year. So as educators, I think we are threading a lot of needles and taking account of many different things when we try, when we experiment, when we introduce methods of learning that differ actually from conventional disciplinary practices and norms. And I think that this is even more challenging and even more difficult at a time when we are attentive to trigger words and safe spaces, when we have been in a sense told, and we ourselves are committing ever more to creating what we're calling safe spaces for students, all the while being committed to engaging with difficult and traumatic histories in realistic ways that do not gloss over, ways that not kind of spare or sugarcoat some of the most violent episodes of human experience in recent times. So these can feel sometimes like conflicting imperatives, and the pressures of doing these things well can often fall on educators like myself, like Feroz, who are trying to experiment with new pedagogical practices or different ones, experimental pedagogy, but in ways that and this is something that I think we need to be mindful of, that in ways that can sometimes not land well for students, and that cannot land well within the metrics and rubrics too of our institution. We can't forget that young educators themselves are ever being, evaluated, summarized, described, critiqued by the very, publics that we're trying to engage in these very difficult and fraught kinds of learning. So just because a pedagogical exercise was rich, was dense, was fruitful, it doesn't mean that it lands well or feels comfortable for students. And sometimes student feedback can reflect those feelings of discomfort in unfavorable ways. And so this is a landscape of experimentation fraught with challenges. It's fraught for students, and it's difficult for educators. And I say all of that simply to sort of maybe seed a conversation or open the door to have a conversation about what some of you in roles of faculty, staff, graduate students maybe are facing in your own realms disciplinarily, but also in the realms that you work in. I'm very interested to see also some of the ways that these issues have cropped up for you and how you've met them. I will say, and maybe Feroz, I don't know if can I switch? Maybe you can just switch to the next slide. So something that is that just my intro? So something, maybe next slide. something that I've done rather recently, really as a nod to my own interest in this topic, but also my own kind of empathy and curiosity for fellow faculty members, working in this field. It led me to engage in a series of interviews. I've called them radical conversations, and they in fact really were in many ways, with a range of faculty members working across disciplines, from historically marginalized backgrounds, who are working strongly with emotion in their teaching. And these were in very informal conversations funded, in fact, by the Peter Wall Institute, in order to ask educators at different stages in their careers how emotion appears in their teaching and learning practice, and how their own thinking about this topic has evolved. And something that was very powerful to hear again and again is the sense that educators are learning constantly, revising, revisiting, reimagining their own teaching practices constantly as the result of the different kinds of classroom experiences they're having. And also a very, very strong sense that, this thing we've all gotten very comfortable as calling sort of emotional labor, plays very differently for different faculty members, depending on their context, and the sort of specific realms in which they're working. And I think that that's something that we don't speak very often about, the extent to which we have very, very different jobs, even though we might carry the same titles. And so I think that's a piece that might lead us toward a greater appreciation of the very varied and diverse kinds of work that we do as educators within different classroom settings. Feroz, do you want to just see do I have a next slide? I think I do. Yeah, this is the last thing then that I just want to mention by way of kind of introduction. This fall, I gave a talk. I was invited to give a talk in what is quite conventionally a sort of a research series. It's the Social Justice Institute at UBC's Noted Scholar series. And I gave a talk very, very much unlike any talk I'd ever given before, as I suppose a way to kind of embody myself a lot of the questions and inquiries that I have been making in my own teaching, but to turn the lens really on myself. The talk was called Things I Learned But Was Not Taught. And it was the very first time that I reflected on how my own sort of formation and development as a scholar was forged in places outside of the classroom, so outside of structures of formal education entirely. And I spoke deeply about my own family. My father is a direct descendant of two Holocaust survivors. My mother grew up in South Asia, daughter of 8 children, and her own experiences of education were absolutely interwoven with legacies of colonial violence in some very, very direct ways. And those experiences of trauma and of intergenerational trauma have deeply informed my own thinking and my own approaches to the topics that I engage with as a researcher. And so this talk was a way of bringing that sort of informal educational experience to bear, actually, and to sort of accorded a certain form of legitimacy or status. And that too, I think, is a way, to widen, our conventional understandings of expertise and to integrate realms of emotionality and emotional experience more broadly. And that was something that I was not only sort of terrified of actually doing, but that I think the feedback from graduate students particularly was affirming that this is a realm, I think, as Feroz alluded to very much, that students are benefiting from. They're benefiting from the ways in which we ourselves take on risk and discomfort. It offers, I think, some sense of relative safety as they experiment in these realms themselves. So that's my intro, and I hope that we can kind of take it from there and speak more broadly about some of your own experiences as well.
That's really illuminating. So much overlap, I'm sure, for myself, and hearing you speak about some of these subjects, and for some of the people in the room too, I'm sure. The next thing we wanted to do was move on to a kind of discussion period, and I believe we have about 8 people here, and I think it might be helpful for you all and us too, if we do go into breakout rooms, and I'm thinking, Charlotte, would you be able to make 2 breakout rooms with participants? And I'll put these in, I'll put these questions into the chat as well, so everyone has them. The first question that I thought could maybe start everyone off is thinking about your own fields, and again, depending on your what capacity you're working at the university, whether it's faculty, staff, or student, but thinking about your fields, disciplines, classrooms potentially, and what the emotional stakes are there, because again, I think it is there's overlaps, definitely, certainly when we're talking about colonialism, for example, as a subject, but there are different stakes as well. And so thinking about those, and I thought that might be a way to start everyone off and talking about where they're coming from and how they're approaching the subject. And then to move into some of the more difficult questions, I think, in some ways, but thinking about the obstacles to embracing emotionality in the classroom generally, or your classrooms in particular, and how we might deal with these obstacles. And then thinking, in a similar vein, how it might be promoted in classrooms in a way that helps students to achieve certain learning outcomes. And certainly I think Tara and I can talk more about our learning outcomes, which differ, at least, I can speak from my own, differ considerably in some ways than others in my discipline, as well as positively impacting their well-being. And we can trouble that notion at the same time. Hi again, everyone. Thanks. I'm sure the other group had just as stimulating a conversation as we were having, and there's so much I think that I want to get through, but we only have about 25 or so minutes left, and so I hope this will be the start of a much longer conversation that some of us can keep going on. Maybe what I'll do is I'll throw one of the things we were struggling with out there to the group, and that can be a start, and then other people can start to chime in with more obstacles or more some solutions or ways to address some of these obstacles. One of the things that came up and was shared quite widely, we were thinking about teaching on some of these subjects that could be construed as difficult, controversial, traumatic even, and trying to broach different ways of approaching these subjects, and for example through emotive expression and being open and vulnerable and such, and how different students react to them, with some students naturally, of course, feeling that it's too intense. And Tara brought this up as well in one of her lectures, students retreating from these kinds of discussions or this kind of work, and wanting us to scale back on it. It's something that I was saying that I experience as well in MES 300. There's a minority, but a significant minority of students who are like, too much, and it's not about the traumatic content per se, but it's too much in being open to this kind of, and opening the classroom to this kind of emotive expression, and them wanting to go back to something more familiar and something more comfortable. And so, the question that's kind of raised is, how much is too much here, and what do we do? How do we bring these students into the fold? Where do we draw certain lines, whether we should draw certain lines with it? And so maybe I'll open it up to everyone here. And of course, people from the group I was in should feel free to share what they said as well, on how do we deal with this? How do we deal with those students who don't want to do this kind of work?
I'll just leap in, Froz, and just say something that emerged from our conversation, our group, and maybe members in that group can chime in if I don't get it quite right, but something that really, I think, corresponds to the question you've just asked of us, for us, is this idea of really departing from a kind of set idea of what that particular class experience is going to look like, having just a lesson plan, roadmap, this is what we're going to do, 45 minutes, 50 minutes, here we go. And instead just being, members of our group were in mediation, instead being a present witness, a deeply kind of present person who is acutely sort of attuned to where people are at, and in response to that, actually, creating the kind of space that allows for sort of, the most engagement possible from where people are at, but also kind of adjusting expectations in even the course of a particular session, accordingly, and actually, not having, in other words, a particularly set program. And I think that sense of it being, one group of 10 students in a seminar is going to have a widely different appetite from a different group of 10 students. Their capacities, their curiosities, their tolerances, their engagement, their relationship to the material is going to be different. And so I think recognizing and becoming familiar with those differences, intimate with the people present, and being very, very present ourselves to those things, and flexible is one of the pieces, at least maybe here.
Thanks so much, Tara. Anyone else like to jump in on that? I mean, I think, I don't want to change the subject because I think there's so much to say on it, but it's leading me to think something else as well on this front, which is that because of what you're suggesting, which I totally agree with, and I've said similar things myself, that there's a degree of uncertainty and risk in what we're doing here, because we can't clamp down and control the classroom like some other instructors do when we're doing this kind of work. And I know from my experiences in the Middle East Studies classroom that things can happen that I am not expecting whatsoever, and we're having to deal with those as they come up in the classroom. And I think one of the other challenges then on the faculty instructor side is convincing instructors to do this kind of work despite the risks that it naturally almost entails, the discomfort for the instructor in dealing with some of these situations, and the lack of, even though I'm doing this work, the lack of knowledge, I would suppose, and the lack of confidence, which I don't think is a bad thing at times in dealing with these kinds of situations. And one of the things that I try to do in my Middle East Studies 300 class when I'm faced with some of these situations is to say, and this is part of that instructor vulnerability piece, being like, I'm unsure of what to do in this moment here. I don't know where to take this discussion from here, and I can make proposals for them, but opening it up to students and bringing them in more into the conversation, not less, not trying to push them out of it and take back control of the classroom, but letting us kind of sit in that discomfort a little bit. But I know that not all faculty and instructors are going to want to do that kind of, are willing, so at least so far, to do that kind of work.
Yeah. I think that something, one of the things that what you just said reminded me of, that also came up in our group conversation, was about this sense that we have as instructors, as educators, that we need to kind of not only have a program, but also when there's a problem, if there's a problem, to fix it, and to have a solution for it, and that sense of reimagining what our role might be, is not coming with kind of solutions oriented teaching, is a hard rewiring for us too, and I think that what is challenging, and this is maybe the elephant in the room, is it's something I tried to allude to earlier, is I think that the relationship of client and I don't know, classrooms have become about student satisfaction largely, also, and students have, because of their own education, their own formation experiences, quite distinct ideas about what kind of a good classroom experience looks like. And a lot of that is about legibility, certitude, outcomes. I mean, for us, I'll just go ahead and speak for you. I know that our own educational experience in the UK was about, go off and just read stuff. There was very little guidance. There was no idea about, are you doing well? There were no pats on the back. There wasn't a little check-in. There was just none of it. And students want, lessons plans. They want, learning outcomes, even not just for the course, but for a particular class. Students have become about rubrics for writing assignments. I mean, it's all become very, very ingrained that kind of successful quality pedagogy is about predictability. It's about, legibility in different ways. And we are, of course we are, we're wanting to give students that sense of comfort. And so we are in many ways moving against that grain by even entertaining these forms of teaching, which are inherently going to include, a higher degree of uncertainty and of risk. And I'll just go ahead and speaking about instructor vulnerability. I was an instructor who, was very complacent in receiving very, very high student evaluations, very high, until I began doing this kind of work. And students don't always love it. And I don't think that it's because it's just difficult in the sense that it's so, it's such traumatic or painful history and they don't like that. But it's also, it doesn't correspond or, directly to the kinds of tangible, measurable outcomes that students have become very, acculturated to expecting. And that's a challenge for us, I think, as instructors, to where do we find our place within that? How invested are we in pushing learning in these directions? And what are the consequences of that for us personally and also for the students? Those are hard pieces, I think.
Absolutely. Would anyone else like to jump in? There's so many great comments in the small groups. I just want people to feel comfortable getting in there.
I could maybe dive in. It's been a real pleasure to listen to you both and discuss in small groups too, but there's just a wealth of knowledge in here. One thing, Tara, that I'm reminded of is we started to discuss writing assignments a little bit in our group. I was noting, Feroz was in the room, and I was noting to him that I really appreciated and hope to learn more about how to make for writing spaces for students to be able to react to difficult material, process their emotions, manage their emotions, those sorts of things. Because as we talked about in the room, like not all students excel in articulating it in the classroom space. So having the writing spaces available to them is important. And Feroz was really good about saying, make these as flexible and as, I think, open as possible to different approaches. But of course, Tara, that comes right back to your question of rubrics and your question of student anxiety. Like not giving a student a rubric and saying, write what you want is actually to a student sometimes really anxiety provoking, right? Yeah. And so one of the things that, it's not across the, I don't want to just raise this problem and quickly solve it, because I think there are a million different ways to come at this. But one thing that I heard this last year that I started to experiment a little bit with is a labor-based model of grading for reflections. So when students are asked to reflect on their learning and reflect on their emotions and write about that sort of thing, it seems especially artificial in that moment to try to evaluate it on a letter grade scale, right? Like, how am I going to talk about the distance that you've traveled individually in your learning, right? You get an A because you whatever. Yeah. So labor-based models, and I can put the name in the chat of the author who's got a couple of free books online about this. He's fantastic. His name is Asayo Inoue, but he's an anti-racist educator out of the States. I think he works in Arizona, but he has a couple of books talking about, look, if you just do the writing according to a basic minimum, or if you attend the classes and sort of in good faith do the work, you get the grade. And that sort of takes the pressure off. It opens up a space for students to really actually articulate themselves. So that's one way to do it, and maybe make space for that openness, Feroz, that you were talking about. But that's, sorry, me taking one thing from our small group and maybe adding something here too. But I would love to hear what other people are doing in terms of encouraging writing or classroom spaces for students to be open about what they're feeling.
I just want to thank you so much, Evan. That's an amazing, contribution, reflection, and actually, just I'm always excited when it comes into the very tangible realm of of evaluation, and I have lots of not only thoughts but emotions about kind of what we're asked to do as educators in that realm, especially people who are working, with emotion, who are asking students students to reflect and to be vulnerable and to take risks. It's very often students from backgrounds I've noticed who feel that actually the grades that they receive are of, predominant importance and sort of singular, emphasis within their own familial structures, and we're telling those students, like, you should take a risk and you should be vulnerable. And by the way, we're going to evaluate you on that. And, it's all going to be okay. I mean, that's a really, really strange space to be in as an educator when we're asking students to do this. So I really, Evan, just appreciate that. And actually, without knowing necessarily what a word for it might be, I've been using kind of deploying, operating in a kind of labor-based model of evaluation where reflections are concerned for quite a while now, simply because I totally agree we cannot be inviting students, soliciting students really to offer of themselves in ways that cannot be yet known to them, that are, by definition, untaught, untrained, and at the same time coming at them with, our own evaluation of how far they've come and what it means to them. So I'm really, really excited by models that, if it isn't encompassing the entire course, which, I'd be happy with too, but if at least is a section or a portion of the course that offers some space for that, I think that's wonderful. And I think there is I'll just offer it, and I don't know about it deeply, and I'm not involved in it myself, but there is an anti-grading movement at UBC amongst faculty. And I think it's a very interesting space, and there's some very dynamic conversations right now happening about the cost to ourselves as educators, and also to pedagogy, to learning generally, that come out of our grading imperatives.
Yeah, and I can say this is something that I really struggled with in the course. I mean, as I said, this is new to me. I mean, I've just been doing this really explicit work in the last 2 years, and for a lot of the discussions we were having and the ways in which I was prepping them for the emotive writing assignment, a lot of it was labor-based, a labor-based model. But then we came to the assignment, and students themselves, because I involved them in creating the criteria with me, I collaborated with them on the basically the parameters of the assignment and the criteria. They wanted it to be worth a lot because they were like putting a lot into it. They were putting a lot into it, and so, but I talked to them. I was really open. I was like, this is really awkward. I don't really want to grade these papers. So it doesn't make sense in some ways for me to grade these papers. We did, we listed a bunch of criteria. We created this criteria together. And students both thought it was too much criteria and too little criteria at the same time. Take from that what you will, but there was quite a lot, I thought, quite a lot of criteria to help guide them, but they at the same time a lot of them wanted more of it, because again, this is so new. They'd never done anything like it before. I mean, I'm not even suggesting that the solution here is more criteria, but one of the things that I'm working on with these students from the course this summer is trying to create better criteria, to provide more guidance to them, even as I'm allowing them space to explore, with their voice and their tone and their interlocutors in these papers and so forth. And so again, I was saying this to Evan in the small group, I feel a real tension here between providing them with lots of instruction on how to do this and then backing off and letting them figure out their own way. And as Evan said, and I really believe this, being a little, trying to become comfortable in a kind of discomfort, to get used to that uncertainty and discomfort at the same time. So it's a real struggle, I think.
I just have a question for what you were just saying, like with students, like finding that balance between like providing guidance, but also giving them freedom to explore. Do you notice, I guess for anyone on this call who's done this, like, does anyone notice there's trends like throughout the course in terms of how that ebbs and flows with a group of students?
I mean, yeah. So one of the things that I would note, I mentioned it in my lecture, and it's come out quite clearly in the data in the course evaluations where students have identified themselves in some form, and then in private conversations, that the students from who are either born in the putative Middle East or had, ancestors were from there and so forth. They loved this, and they were into it, like right from the very, very start, because they had never, most of them in their courses, education, even their lives, had never been asked to do these kinds of things or to engage in this ways of thinking and writing. And so they were very much into it and got a lot out of it. And the struggle, I mean, and we have to think also, when I'm talking about this with people outside of UBC, like it really depends on the demographics at your university. Like in my class or MES classroom, it's like mostly students who of Middle Eastern descent. That's not the case everywhere else, and so this would have to be employed differently in a different institution. But students who were Caucasian, North American, European, there was a kind of split there. There's some students who perhaps, I had quite a few students from GRSJ, and they were exposed to some of this in the past and like this kind of work. But a great number of students, especially from certain disciplines like poli-sci, IR, who really struggled and didn't like it. So there was that split. In large part based on origin and race and ethnicity, but not exclusively. So that's one thing that I definitely stuck out to me. The gender split, we're still exploring that. The class, that course, that we studied, examined at least, was predominantly female, as well as self-identified female. So I don't know, I guess that speaks to something of what students have heard about the class as well, and what their expectations are. But there were a few again, self-identified men from the course, again, from certain disciplines, who were like, no, I don't want to be, this is not what I signed up for here. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the context. I'd just be curious too, and I don't know if the data provides more details in terms of like how those students were feeling like throughout the course itself, because that split was very evident, it seems like, from the data you gathered. But I'd be curious, like, as they do more assignments or they get more engaged in this, like these pedagogical approaches, how their discomfort is mapped throughout the term.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm hoping to do is to do more studies and further refine some of the studies to get at some of that. I feel like we've really just scratched the surface here with a lot of these surveys and focus groups. I don't think it would be like a straight line for any of them, though. And some of the ones that who were regulars at office hours, they were struggling. They're struggling a lot with what they're feeling. Some of the readings that we would do that struck particular nerve with them. And so it's really on a week-to-week basis. But I think there was overwhelming excitement for the idea of the emotive writing assignment. Now, when they actually got into it, and with some students, they leave it right till the end, of course, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, what am I doing? I have no clue here what I'm doing." That was something different, and that's again why we're working on it this summer and trying to make it more meaningful, make it more productive for students when they embark on this assignment, and really, again, trying to get them to work on it sooner and give them different models and provide them with different examples of what this can look like, while not restricting them to those models at the same time. Because once they got into the assignment and they actually started it, they were really struggling, and I would say some in a really good, productive way, and some less so. That we are out of time, actually. Well, I just say thank you so much for being a part of the discussion and contributing and listening. Tara and I, we both continue to work on this subject, and as I just said, this is something that I'm going to definitely keep working on with my Middle East studies classes and new studies, creating new interventions and such. And so please, stay in touch if this is something that you're interested in, or you're doing this kind of work. We'd love to hear from you. And I can say for myself that we're thinking about, I'm talking about me and these students, we're thinking about what we can do more and collaborations across the university outside of Middle East studies and so forth. So please do stay in touch. And I ran a workshop about a month ago, and a lot of people have contacted me through that, after that, to say, let's work together and let's share what we are doing. And so please do be in touch with both, either of us, if you want to continue doing this kind of work and exploring it.
Yeah, I want to echo Faraz's thanks, huge gratitude actually to all of you, really all of you, for listening and contributing so actively today. And I'm just delighted actually that there's such interest amongst fellow educators and people who are in classroom spaces and other spaces in this topic. And I'm thrilled actually by the idea that we might still be in conversation even long into the years ahead as we try and experiment together. Yeah, thank you all.